Hello, I'm Deborah Malone, founder of The Internationalist and host of Internationalist Marketing TV. Today's guest is Susan Schramm, author of Fast Track Your Big Idea. Susan, it is a wonderful personal pleasure to invite you to the show because I know that you've had an extraordinary career and now you are turning that into helping others through an amazing new book. I just can't wait to have our conversation. So welcome, welcome, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's been a long time in planning, and I appreciate your invitation to this amazing community of marketers.
Well, you're very kind. You're very kind, but you've also helped a lot of leaders turn bold ideas into reality. So it might be an obvious question, but what inspired you to write Fast Track Your Big Ideas? And just remind us also of the subtitle because I think that sets things up in a beautiful way.
Right. The book is called Fast Track Your Big Idea, Navigate Risk, Move People to Action, and Avoid Your Strategy Going Off Course. And therein lies the story, right?
Sounds
Because,
like it.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Because actually, what the genesis of this book was frustration. I kept seeing great ideas get stuck or quietly die, whether it was inside big companies, with nonprofits, with churches, community initiatives. And you'd see smart, committed people or teams pour energy into a really good plan. And 6 months later, it get bogged down. And the consequences were not only that the impact of the strategy wasn't working as the targets, but the people were frustrated and demoralized and sometimes jump ship. So this caused me to reflect because I saw it in my own initiatives, and then I started doing research about other initiatives, and I realized there was a common pattern. It was that the riskiest part of the strategy wasn't the product, the service, the economy, right? That was often the challenge. People always said, oh, they would blame some piece. It was people. People you needed to take action didn't.
That
Oops.
that's that's pretty profound because you're right. It's risk brings up a lot of different subjects in people's minds. I mean, I think that these times that we live in geopolitically are full of risk and so on and so forth. And I know part of your book actually breaks down how one defines risk and so on. But let's for a moment segue to the big idea portion, because risk and big idea are very much connected in how you approach this. Now, as you well know, given your work history, marketers thrive on big ideas. You've been a marketer, a business leader, a consultant to nonprofits and to other organizations. But as you know, the distance between a great belief and real world impact can be pretty wide. What do you, what's your first piece of advice to marketers? And then let's drill down a bit. What's the first thing in terms of ideas, risk, and your strategy?
Well, let me just frame that. Yes, I actually got into marketing unexpectedly. I started in sales, got frustrated because marketing wasn't serving the sales conversation very well, and then found out it wasn't that marketing wasn't doing their part, is that the strategy was flawed. And so I found myself moving into asking the fundamental questions. And often marketers live right in the gap between a brilliant idea and real world execution. That is exactly where they sit. Often with a big idea that wasn't their own. Someone walks in, often too late, by the way. People bring in marketing often later than, a lot of decisions have been made, whether it's a joint venture or some big investment. And then they're saying, okay, let's make a big splash out of this. And that puts the marketer into an interesting role because in many times fundamental questions have to be asked about this strategy and this idea that could change perceptions or behaviors. And often the strategy hasn't been thought through. And the marketer has an amazing, unique opportunity right then. to call out some questions that often people are assumptions that haven't been stated or beliefs that aren't really understood or in conflict on a team. And and to get the job done, marketers often have to work with large teams, both internal teams and external teams. So there's a lot of alignment required for marketers. So at the end of the day, my view about the big idea when it comes to marketing is your idea is probably fine. It's not stalled because it's a bad idea, but it's because the thinking through different people executing risk differently hasn't been done. That's that's the opportunity that marketing has, and often where we miss the opportunity because we're not necessarily courageous enough to call the question.
You make a good point, and you started as well by talking about how often marketers are charged with being the champion of an idea that is not their own. I mean, how often have we heard the CEO has a new initiative, whatever it might be? It might be sustainability, whatever the initiative is, and suddenly marketing has to translate that and whip everybody else up, to help it go through. There's a lot of elements to this. It's the reframing risk. You said by also asking better questions. Now, and you talked about the people side of risk. Now, I may be blurring all this, but could you just run us through a little bit more about is the asking questions a way of making it less risky so that everyone's on the same page, and then talk about the people side of risk?
Yeah. And I'm going to start with the people side of this because I think um, what what is risk? Like when you say risk, what word comes to mind when I say risk?
I think most people think danger, danger.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Danger,
yeah,
danger.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
Most people do think danger. It is interesting. Entrepreneurs often will say, "Oh, it's opportunity," or financial advisors, "Oh, risk reward." But most people think of risk as a negative, and we all know intellectually that it's an unknown. My definition of risk is it's an unknown. It could be positive, it could be negative, and it sometimes can be both. The challenge, obviously, is to clarify the unknown. The unknown itself creates anxiety. And that is what I think I learned was underestimated. We would charge in with great ideas, and if the people who are needing to take action haven't had their issues addressed, whether that's clarity about what it is we're trying to do, or it's the fact that you've put them in a position where they will be um, embarrassed or have to learn something or change the way they're doing things, that ends up creating risk in their heads. And our brains, it's interesting, our brains have been wired so that if we don't have a plan in our head, our brains react to it in a fight or flight mechanism. So we start actually creating physical anxiety because people are like, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Even if the room sounds very cool. Oh, we've got this detailed plan. But in the back of someone's head, if it's going to put them in a position of looking poorly or if of investing something they're not sure of, they will hesitate. And that's the risk I see. The strategies the game plan that I encourage people to use is really to go back to elements of a strategy that a marketer does 101. You lay out elements of a good game plan, and those help you communicate very well, but they also force clarity about the strategy itself and the what ifs that if you don't anticipate them can cause people to stall.
That makes a lot of sense, but let's make it even clearer. Can you give us a specific moment in your career when maybe a big idea went wrong and it made you think, either was it about risk, was it about structure, or was it about people, or and I'm sure all of this, factored into you doing the book. But make it more concrete for us.
So I'm sitting around in a product launch team meeting, And we've got this great product that's been worked on. I was in tech for years, and it was lots of dollars went into getting it to that point. And we've got our milestones, and it's evident to me that the product will not actually do what we had been telling the marketplace it would do. And I brought up the topic and said, okay, my role at the time was the go-to-market side of it. And I said, is it possible? I said, what would it take to get it to the point that it can do what we said? Because there's revenue implications if we don't, right? And there's frustration. The field will be frustrated, the customers will be frustrated. And the answer I got from the product management and R&D was, the train has left the station, right? Either get on board or get out of the way. And I was younger in my career at the time. And I was, the room went silent. And yet this uncertainty was hanging in the air. And that's an example where a choice, a culture around that table had been built that it wasn't okay to talk about the risks. The risks were too great. We couldn't stand the idea that we had a product with millions of dollars of investment about to go out the door, and we couldn't stand the idea that there was a risk that it wouldn't meet the need. And so probably that was a turning point for me in two ways. One, not surprisingly, we brought the product to market. We did our best as a sales and marketing team to uh, pat down the parts that we were claiming that was going to be great and re-swizzle it. But it did end up resulting in a lack of trust. We created a lack of trust because we'd been pumping it one way and it didn't deliver. And that made me realize that the consequences were great. It would have been actually better to launch it to a narrower market where the value would be greater for them. And SEDEX to come up with other stories about why we had a phased approach. There's lots of ways that actually marketing people are very confident in repositioning, actually better than a CEO. Like, how many times have you walked in a room and a CEO to your side says, I don't have anything to say? You say, it's okay. We don't have all the answers. But in silence, they will make up their own. So we have to say things, right? That's often the role of a marketer when things are difficult. And and what I realized is that most uh, folks just needed a new language to talk about risk objectively, not blaming, not defensively, and not sounding like Debbie Downer, or Dave Downer, right? That's the challenge. Sometimes when the subject comes up, especially from a marketing person, right? You're not supposed to be talking about this. You're supposed to be go make everybody happy with it, right? But I think it is a grounding rod that can start a new conversation, and you can actually feel a breath in the room that say, oh, we're going to actually talk honestly. And that's where I've really spent the rest of my career, driving conversations with boards, with leadership teams, with partnerships, joint ventures. I was part of many spin outs, acquisitions, all those scenarios where a whole bunch of assumptions have been made, but very few have been stated. And so getting that on the table is the kind of courage that I'm striving to encourage people to feel a sense of confidence in bringing this topic up.
You also talked about something that I think is very important, and you may not even realize that you said it. You talked a little bit when you gave the example of how this product launch was not particularly brilliant. You talked about how you lost trust. Now, that I'm assuming that's certainly trust on the part of the potential customer, but I'm assuming as well, and I shouldn't have assumptions, but I'm asking you if that was also a lack of trust among the team,
Oh, without
among,
question.
yeah,
Without
among the
question. Can you
players.
imagine? Yeah, it was it's funny how in retrospect you walk away and go, I should have said this, and I should have said this, right? Well, again, I realized that if the environment wasn't safe to be able to have uncomfortable conversations, then it was not what it did was it meant that anybody in the room with an objection shut down, right? And with that, when that happens, you, as the owner of the big idea, you're the one that loses. Because at the end of the day, people don't take action. If they're confused, if they're skeptical, if they're not aligned, they don't take action to get your strategy working. And this idea that, tops down, just go do it, uh, cultures, then they're surprised that it fails, right? That's what I'm really saying is that it's the culture of the leadership and the environment that you're creating by openly talking about risk that lets people anticipate, oh, from the beginning, there will be risks we know, and there will be risks we don't know. How are we going to adapt? Let's from the beginning recognize that this game plan is just a wish. It's a guess of how it's going to work. Let's agree as to how we'll bring up conversations that are uncomfortable, but we need to consider. Some of those are because of internal issues, like my case. Some are because of external issues. Your biggest customer leaves, or the market the pricing, that supply chain changes. So some of them are easier to talk about. Um, some that are really hard are when you have a leader who's not performing and you're putting a big bet on that leader, right? And those two are hard because at the end of the day, your your execution strategy is highly dependent on people that if they're not prepared, you will fail. And so we really as a my goal is that people just use these tools that I've laid out in the book to start early and have conversations about risk as part of their planning of an idea, and then be able to set that cultural tone so that as things come up, it's a very comfortable rigor to say, okay, let's do assessment. What's working, what's not? It's just a classic case. What risks are we not talking about that we should be?
And you've also coined in many ways the term de-risk, and that does seem to be at the center of what you're talking about. The thing that I was thinking about when you were talking a little bit about top down and leadership is that marketers in particular work with so many people, whether it's their ad agencies, whether it's other departments. So there's a lot of different people to get on board. And I'm just wondering that in our now work from home environment, if that makes de-risking easier, in that more people feel that, they're not in the room and feel the tension and that they can start to bring things up. Or maybe it has just an opposite effect, but I think it's an interesting point for marketers because they have to get so many people on board. Do you have any experience with
Oh,
that?
well, and let's you have several things really that you just brought up are interesting. I hadn't thought about the benefit of remote work that allows for people to have a safe, comfortable environment, be around the table virtually, and say things that they might not otherwise say, um, because it's somehow different than sitting right next to somebody. That's interesting. Let me tell you a story about an interesting one I worked on where this became true. I was working on an acquisition where a company had bought a lot of different assets with the intent of being a holding company. And they started shifting the strategy to integrate their back office and integrate a lot of things. The challenge was all the different company leaders were not familiar with each other. They weren't friends. They hadn't hung out. They'd all just been, acquired. And what was interesting was their tendency was that they knew they needed to build a new strategy, but it was during COVID and they couldn't, people couldn't fly. And so I said, that's okay. Let's dive in. And what we did was I laid out the questions I lay out in the de-risk system. And I said, first of all, answer these questions yourself, by yourself, right? Reflect on these very fundamental elements of your strategy, not only your own company strategy, but this combined company strategy. Think about it yourself. Then we took the content and shared it to everybody. So again, before they ever were in the room virtually, They got to see the disparity of perspectives, the good ideas they didn't even know about, but the small voices got to be heard, and and so we put all that together. Then we convened and talked through in small groups, in breakouts and everything, talk through where there was alliance, everybody agreed, and then where there were big disconnects. And what was interesting about it was everybody was surprised at how many good ideas there were. And there weren't as many disconnects as they expected. And then even in breakout rooms, they started to have fun. You'd set up the question. So they'd say, what's the biggest issue? What's the biggest disconnect? And what's one way to address it, right? So they weren't focusing, oh, we don't agree. It was just like, what first steps could we take? End result was we did pull them together. We ended up having a hybrid model where we got some people in a room um, over time. But what really I learned from this was that they were from cultures all over the world. I learned that that value of thinking through a process and giving people time to both digest strategic questions themselves and then see the benefit of seeing them together um, made it safer to bring up conversations that were uncomfortable in a facilitated way. And it was all about the strategy. It wasn't about pointing fingers at people. It's like, okay. So yeah, I think you've got something there.
No, I think, but I also think you've also outlined, almost de-risk in action. Let me just ask you something else about issues that marketers often face. And I mean, we've all seen brands kind of lose their way mid-launch. Um, and not necessarily to your point that the idea was wrong or that the strategy was wrong, but sometimes because people stop communicating or adapting or doing what you just suggested, going through ideas and going through obstacles without any sense of right or wrong, or just trying to explore. But how do you help marketing leaders recover when their big idea goes off course?
Um, I have a program I call the Strategy Reboot, which is exactly like that. In fact, that's my perfect client is the one who has spent a huge amount of energy and it's stalled because they're more likely to listen to shifting gears a little bit than someone at the beginning who's like, I got this. Um, a couple of thoughts come to mind. One, take a breath. I mean, your strategy was a guess. So let's give everybody some grace here, right? Um, and if you hadn't set the tone of this adaptive mindset at the beginning, then now it's time to, right? Because the brilliance is when you first start an initiative, if we can all say, we have a premise, this is a premise, and we're going to work through a plan. And then in the beginning, say, what are the possibilities of what might go wrong? What are the uh, different perceptions that can have of the result. But at the time when you're stuck, the most important thing I look at comes down to one, validating, is this still relevant, right? It could be that the world swirled around you so much that your premise was really good for the time you did this, but something has changed. And we see that so much now in the environment, the political environment, the health environment, whatever. Something that seemed really relevant suddenly becomes seeming, parked. So the relevance becomes important. Again, that's an objective decision. How relevant? One of the things I challenge people is clarify your why. What problem do you solve for whom? And why is it urgent right now? And who is it urgent for now? It could be a different audience, right? Your premise about who would be urgent for is just as important because you could narrow your focus to those where it's relevant. The next big turning point becomes if this is still relevant, then the question becomes who has to take action for this to succeed? And again, I think marketing is challenged because we have so many audiences, right? We think in personas, we think this way. Unfortunately, it can drown you because you have so many audiences that you are anticipating. So narrowing to which ones are critical to take action will help you tune not just the message, but it helps you tune your time and energy into those that are really there. Now, the next question to take is, say you have a list, you went from a list of, 15 personas to five, or actual list of people. And these groups of people have to be the ones that uh, take action, or the rest of it won't matter. At that point, here's where risk comes in again. What is the risk profile of that group or those people? What to them would be risky about taking action with us? And, in branding, it's funny because branding is it's an appeal, it's a broad, high level message, but it's a promise. It's a promise. And the question comes down to who who wants to take that promise, or why wouldn't they? And again, getting under the risk profile. There's two dimensions. And let's talk about risk profiles. Have you seen risk profiles ever be part of a persona study?
I don't know because particularly now with synthetic personas and so on, there's so much that's going on here. But when you're talking about risk personas now, I think it's something that is often forgotten because I don't think people are thinking about whether their customers
Right.
are going to expect this offering to to align with their risk levels. I mean,
Well, and they,
that's
they
yeah.
don't expect it, but here's where it's possible. Um, so there's two dimensions of a risk profile. The one is the awareness of risk, and the other is the engagement with risk. And when let's just be really, you're coming out with a new consumer product, and let's just think through what are the risks of a consumer when they look at a product? You tell me, you've been seeing so many.
When they look at okay, let's just take a crazy product then, liquid death. It's a water, that's trying to break through in water. The risk is that not everyone will find it funny,
Oh,
or
exactly.
not
Duh.
everyone,
Okay.
or yeah.
So you right now have someone who will look at that, and from an awareness of risk, that there will be people who will will see this as something that is risky to them because it's unknown, right? And not funny. And the risk that they're taking when they engage is, I'm going to spend money on something that's not good, or I will not have a result that is promised, something like that. Um, but what's interesting about it is when you look at teams, say your product is something where teams have to execute something. And what's interesting is a person can have a risk profile, but groups, when they come together, create their own risk profile. And so the challenge is, you might have a CEO who thinks, this is great, let's implement this digital transformation and execute this cool tool. But to the extent that inside that team, there's people who will view that as challenging the way they did things before, or wasting their time because they have other things on their plate. The challenge is that even though the CEO who bought the thing, or the product guy who bought your product, is very enthusiastic about it, for them to get it done through their organization, there are other people at the table who have different views of the risk of this product. And that's where I find back to the idea of starting by understanding what's the possible risks of this initiative. That idea of adoption, market adoption, often is because we think about um, a simplistic view. They don't like the product, but it could be something way different than the product. It's not just the price and the product. It could be that it disrupts they have kids at home and they're working full time, and there's no room for me to take on another project. Or it's a scenario where they've very invested in the way they do things, and this is going to require a learning curve where they might look dumb. So so the time to I would just suggest that if all marketing did was, in addition to the different ways they think about the personas that they're marketing to in a turnaround, step back and say, who has to take action? Why would they take it? And what risks are they taking? And I think it will surface, the exercise will surface people to consider one, targeting more effectively, or two, proactively in their message and their launch, address the risk objections as part of the offering again. And, narrowing and testing that would be a really good way to get momentum back as you start you know, regaining momentum.
Well, momentum is an interesting word because I'll go through one other, marketing topic, which I think that marketers now have to deal with. And there's no question that marketers are now under pressure to move fast. Okay, that's now part of it. It's not only to innovate, but innovate at speed.
Yes, true.
They've got to launch, adapt, show ROI. I mean, we all know this. But your book also, I mean, we just talked about how, if in a strategy reboot, if something stalled, one of the first things you might want to do is ask if it's still relevant, given how quickly things change in the world. But your book also suggests that momentum may not be about speed alone. It's really about alignment. And I know we've been talking around this, but let's just talk about that, just for a minute in terms of how people might slow down to go faster. I think that book title might have been taken already, but just talk about that because that is something where I think a lot of marketers are afraid to stop once the
And
momentum
what's interesting?
begins.
I think marketing, if you think of the role of marketing in an organization, I think we should have a new name. It should be the Chief Alignment Officer. Because in many ways, you said earlier, their role is often bringing people together to work cohesively to fulfill a brand promise, right? That's a big deal. What I've always been humbled by the role in marketing. At one point, just so you say, at one point I worked on a press release for a partnership. I had 112 versions of the press release. Why? Because when you're writing a press release, you are essentially clarifying roles, responsibilities. You're clarifying how this partnership will function. Well, guess what? They weren't aligned. And it showed up when you start to communicate. In fact, that's my most favorite part of marketing and communications is that we are almost the crucible for clarity on things that people have not, thought through. So if you think about the power of alignment and the power that marketing has in terms of calling out the fact that at the end of the day, if we're not aligned, this execution will not work. But also to facilitate alignment in a way that um, is not get on board or do it my way, but is
Non-threatening.
thoughtful.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
non-threatening.
it's
It's
collaborative.
it's been de-risked.
It's been de-risked and it's objective. And so the kinds of things, yes, I do in the book. I say sometimes you have to go slower to go faster if you want an outcome. Now, if you measure yourself on launches, then have at it, right? Because usually it's not the launch that's the metric. It is the launch. You got it out the door. And under all this pressure, it's very fair to challenge the speed metric to say there's two dimensions. There's a speed to getting something out the door, and there's a speed to adoption. So let's get more realistic about what are the stages of adoption and how will we measure success versus simply go, 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 right? And that's okay. I mean, how many times did we hire a bunch of salespeople or put a bunch of money into a marketing campaign and senior management would think, okay, now where's the revenue? Okay, where's the revenue tomorrow? And I got over time, having been beat up enough times, I got a lot more direct early on to say, let's talk about the stages of adoption and when that will pan out. It usually was an uncomfortable conversation because most senior leaders by that point want to just push a button and get money, right? That was the thinking. And in digital, the great thing about digital is you get early feedback, right? That's the best part. And even if you use digital to test, or you do use digital to have these early steps where you're not asking people to do the whole thing. I worked a lot in heavy infrastructure sales, which was way harder it takes a lot of energy to get those played out and get your revenue. But we learned over time, oh, pilots are our friends, not even pilots, whiteboard pilots, where you can walk through and say, or even the old issue of the classic customer focus group of would you buy this if it looked like this? But I think in many times the alignment that a marketing person can do from the point of view of this objective process that you can take people through. What's the problem we solve? Who do we solve it for? Why are we the right ones to solve it? Who has to take action in this team of customers or segment or channel? What if these different scenarios would happen? What's the decision-making process that they have to go through? Um, in fact, marketers, when they read the book, they'll look at it and go, oh, yeah, this is what we do every day. Yeah, that's right. You do. But the book was written to help you bring people along. I wrote it very intentionally so it could be very accessible to someone who's never, ever been in any kind of marketing communications role uh, or strategy role. And it was intended to create a language that could bond people, whatever their background, finance, operations, frontline customer service, and which often a marketing team is put in that situation of bringing all those people together. But a lot of the times these turn out to be perfect for your messaging. I mean, they are fundamental to creating a playbook for how to communicate, but they're also where the alignment shows up or the lack of alignment showed up. So again, I think marketing as a chief alignment officer is another angle that may not be on your card, but it absolutely has to be in your mindset of proactive de-risking and proactive alignment.
I think that you have said it all so well with not only examples but with passion. And I'm glad that you took us through so much of that, and I can easily see what, yeah, obviously what prompted writing the book. And I love that you talked about how the language is such that anyone, at any stage in any division can understand things with greater clarity. On a closing note, although I dare say that this may not be a final note because I think that we'll have to discuss a lot of other areas or maybe apply them to specific situations, which could be a very interesting series. But I would also just ask you, is aside from alignment, because words are important, is there any one message that you would leave with marketers?
Um, Bring up the subject of risk simply by in everyone in any meeting could end the meeting by simply say, before we close, what risks should we be talking about that we're not? And what that does is two things. It acknowledges that there are risks. It doesn't make you, you know, whatever level in the organization you are, it allows you to come across as genuine and authentic because we all know in our heads there are risks, but just saying that. The other thing it does is it gives permission for people to actually voice their concerns. And as a leader, it allows people to have courage to bring up issues that are draining them and causing them to think in the shower this might go wrong. And it also gives a group of people a comfort level with being more vulnerable. So that's my request. My goal is to normalize My personal goal in writing the book is to normalize conversations about risk. So they're a normal attribute of great leadership. It's not about defending the perfect program. It's about, sure, there's risk and there'll always be. We're going to be adaptive, but let's just make sure we're all in one, we're hearing each other. And one thing I'd also suggest is creating a rhythm of having people come scanning the marketplace, scanning what's going on. So it's not just the risk inside that we're not going to be ready, but it's the environment. So people are more open to having an eye for down the road, that might be something we need to consider. And what if everything goes right? Are we going to be prepared? Right? There's a lot of different kinds.
That's a nice risk.
Yeah,
That's a nice risk. But I think what's wonderfully relevant about this is it's very clear that we're living. I mean, anyone can say these times are uncertain, but they're certain. But I think that the feeling of uncertainty has been amped up. And one of the things I appreciate is that you're applying some rules to business and to disciplines that we love and ideas which can change people's lives and change the world, and figuring out or helping people figure out that there can be a way forward. So thank you, and get the book. Get
yeah.
the book. And
Fast track
I
a
have
big idea.
and I have a feeling that we'll be talking. Thank you. Thank you for sharing
So
all of that. Thank you.
good conversation. Thanks a lot, Deborah.
Thanks. The Internationalist focuses on the continual reinvention of marketing by highlighting inspirational marketers around the world and their ideas as they move the industry forward. Internationalist Marketing TV shares these perspectives through interviews and personal stories. Thanks so much for watching. If you find this kind of content helpful, please click like or subscribe. Again, thanks so much.